Yes, it's being
Oh, right.
recorded.
Alrighty. First of all, thanks for coming to this meeting. Um, Virtual has become the way of life for us. Hopefully, we see a light at the end of the tunnel where we'll be able to actually see each other face to face again. We have some announcements. So, Perry, do you want to talk about the training camps coming up?
Yes, ma'am. The three training camps for this year have been scheduled. They are on the division web page. The first one of them is May 29th. It will feature um, it's an expanded version of Weathering with Pan Pastels. It adds to the meeting, or excuse me, it adds to the clinic using washes along with the pastels. It really is an interesting process. Made some major changes and did some experimenting when when Walt Lyles and I did the presentation live and in person um, and participatory with the British region last year. Um, they enjoyed the heck out of it, and it's expanded. And I even played around and did some extra stuff for that one. The next training camp is July 31st, and it will be building a wooden structure from a bar mills kit. We did that clinic 2 years ago and sold out. So we're going to do it again um, virtually um, with bar mills kits. You'll be able to order your bar mills kit from Steve Funston at Blue Ox Trains, and he's been gracious and has said that people who want to participate in the training camp will be able to order a kit from him and get a discount. I'll put together. I have a list of tools, the same list of tools that we had, or tools and materials that we needed for 2 years ago. That same list will apply this time, and you'll just need to have your own materials and stuff there, and you'll have to prime your kit ahead of time. But it'll be an interesting kit or an interesting training camp. And then hopefully for the one in September, we'll be back to live and we'll be able to meet in person and learn more about scenery. So we've got training camps for the year scheduled out.
Okay, and this one coming up and the build out one are both virtual.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Alrighty. Charlie, do you want to talk about the El Chirilla's Award and the model contest?
Yes, I am Charlie Mason, your Achievement Program Chairman for the Piedmont Division, and I have two topics tonight. I would like to announce that Al Chirilla, who is currently a master model railroader, has just earned the Association Volunteer Certificate. This is Al's eighth certificate, and I want to congratulate Al, and your certificate will be in the mail shortly. The second thing is I would like to announce that the Piedmont Division is going to have a model contest in the month of April. This will be a little different than what we've done in the past. This will be a drive-up contest. The date is Saturday, April 17th. The place is the parking lot of Blue Ox Trains in Roswell. And the time is you can show up anytime between 11 in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll have some tables set up outside. We have arranged a panel of 8 judges to look over your models, to judge them. We will photograph your models. Uh, you will, at that time, learn whether or not you've earned a merit award, and we will provide criticisms of your model. After all of the entries have been judged, Then we will determine the contest winners, and those winners will be announced during the May division meeting. We will also show the photographs of all of the entries into the model contest. Um, if for some reason it rains that day, Steve Funston has said we can use the upstairs room at Blue Ox Trains. So regardless, rain or shine, we will have a model contest. There are a couple of things you need to know is every model that's entered must have two pieces of paperwork. It will need a entry contest form, which is form number 901, and a judge's scoring sheet, which is form number 902. These forms can be downloaded from the NMRA website. So fill out the entry forms. Make sure you tell us how you built your model, anything that's unique, what you have added to it. Include plans or photographs of a prototype or something similar to it. Let's see. Anyway, if you have any questions, you can always call or send me an email. But again, the contest will be Saturday, April 17th in the parking lot of Blue Ox Trains in Roswell from 11 to 3 o'clock. You don't have to spend the whole time there. Just drive up with your model, bring it out, we judge it, then take it home with you. Thank you, and I hope you'll get your models ready, and we'll have a contest with a lot of entries. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. I see that Hank is not on the list yet, so he might be trying to get in on the website that's in error. Anyway, he was going to talk about the train show, which all of you already know is scheduled for October 2nd and 3rd. We've got about a third of the table sold, which is very good. We've got our layouts picked out. We know who's going to be there. We're going to use every inch of that building that we possibly can for trains. So it'll be a really fun show. Once we get past the Women's Expo up there in Cartersville, which is the 27th of March, their team will start promoting us in the area and doing things with I'm reading a thing here. They'll be promoting us extensively in the area and get some radio coverage up in that area, and it'll be running on their billboard, their electronic billboard outside. So it'll be really fun beyond all of the Facebook stuff and all the spreading that we will do for it. So it should be a really exciting show. What one of my goals is to keep the changing hats here. One of my goals is to try and get all of us trained people having fun again. So if you know of a scheduled event that you want to have put on the Piedmont calendar, let me know and we'll get it out there. I put in riding the live steamers over in Conyers for one of them. So anyway, I keep adding to the list. So if you find anything, let me know and we'll take care of it. We have already put the new train show flyers in the hobby shop. So I want to thank Hank for that because he drove around and actually delivered 6 different places. So that was really nice. That saved us some money. That saved us $45 in shipping. It's crazy. So anyway, the next thing, we had a fellow division member pass away. His name was Charles Longley. It was probably about 2 weeks ago, would you say, Walt?
It was something like that.
Yeah. He had been very ill for a long, long time. So we just wanted to pass that along to you, those of you who maybe knew him. Todd is our guest speaker tonight. He's smiling up there. Todd has studied railroads since growing up alongside the Northeast Corridor in New Jersey. He is a graduate of Denison University in Grantville, Ohio, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts, majoring in history. DeFeo is editor of railfanning.org and the founder of DeFeo Group. And he has authored 2 books. One is called The Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad, and the other one is The Western and Atlantic Railroad. And he's our guest speaker tonight. So there he is. So let's get him started on his clinic. You ready, Todd?
I'm ready.
And
All
Todd, you are the presenter, so off you go.
All right, let's see if I can remember to do this. This is the real key here. And if I let's see, let me know if you can see this here in a second. It might take 1 second here.
It just popped up.
Oh, it worked this time. We spent 10 minutes the other day. We couldn't get it to work, so I'm glad it worked without a hitch. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to be here today and talk about 2 of my favorite railroads. I don't like to limit how many of my favorite railroads I have, so I'll just say they're 2 of my favorite railroads. The Western and Atlantic Railroad and the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad. I presume since we're in and around the Atlanta area, I presume most people are probably more familiar with the Western and Atlantic Railroad. But these are 2 pretty interesting railroads, in my opinion, because they date to pretty much the same vintage in the sense that they're both ante-bellum railroads and they're both Southern railroads. So they have a lot of striking similarities, but they have an incredible difference in what the outcome was for both of them. I'm going to give a brief little history and then do a little comparison of the 2 railroads, and then I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions that anybody may have as we get going. But I wanted to kind of start this one off here as a little bit of a scene setting, just to kind of illustrate some of the geography that I'm talking about for these 2 different railroads. And on the bottom right-hand side, this usually works better when I present in person because I can bring a laser pointer and point to it. But the 2 red dots on the map here are Atlanta and Chattanooga, and that is where the Western and Atlantic Railroad runs, 138 miles between those 2 cities. And then kind of in the center top portion, there are 2 blue, they're not dots, I guess they're pins on a map, really. And that's where the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad ran. It ran about 82 miles between Guthrie, Kentucky, and Paris, Tennessee. And I've also put, just for sake of some additional geography, the gray pin on the map is Memphis. The white pin is Nashville. And the black pin on the map is Bowling Green, Kentucky, which was important for where ultimately Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville helped form the Memphis branch of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which was built after the L&N built its main line between Louisville and Nashville, but this was Louisville to Memphis run. It formed an integral portion of that. But these railroads really were instrumental in several developments in several key cities in the South. The postcard picture on the bottom there is a view of Atlanta from the 1920s or 1930s. In the middle there, we have a view of Nashville, Tennessee, both great railroad towns back then and still are today. And then in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of Paris, Tennessee. And if we have any L&N fans, Paris, Tennessee was a very important depot and repair facility for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for many years. It's not as busy of a railroad town these days, but certainly had a great history tied to railroads.
Todd.
Yes.
If I can interrupt for just a second.
Absolutely.
From when we were testing the other day, we've got just the not the full screen view, but the next slide previous. There we go. That's it.
It's backwards from the other day. I don't know what I did the other day versus today, but
now you got it.
I thought I don't have any notes, so there's no real secrets in my presentation. But can everyone, this looks good now?
Yep, that's it.
All right, perfect. So you can probably see this a little bit better than
yes.
Yeah, so perfect. So that's just a quick little geography lesson. I was a history major, not a geography major, so that's the sum total of my knowledge on the geography front. But pretty straightforward, I believe. I'm going to mention some of these cities, so I like to do that up front just to kind of give everybody a lay of the land. So interestingly, the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad is not a super well-known railroad today. It has a great history. It has a great history in the sense it was never always a super highly regarded railroad, even from its earliest inception. It was created to build effectively between Guthrie, Kentucky, and Paris, Tennessee. And it was so derided by people in the local community and people in the press that it was said that it was a railroad that would begin in the woods and end in a hollow tree. So if that tells you something about how well received it was, it's a great name for the railroad. Maybe not if you were an investor in the railroad at that point in time. But it served a really important purpose. And it was chartered in 1852, which of course is about a decade before the Civil War broke out. It was chartered by the state of Tennessee and took them built fairly quickly based on how a lot of other railroads built. We're going a little bit deeper into the history of it. It was fully completed by 1861. So while it was not exactly a well-regarded railroad in terms of where it was going to run, it was also a poorly timed railroad because it opened just in time for the Civil War, which, as we know, was not exactly a great period of history for railroads and ultimately ravaged a lot of railroads, certainly in the South. And the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville was no exception to that. It was able to rebuild itself in the year after the Civil War, and it was fraught with problems. And we're gonna get a little bit deeper into this, but it basically had lots of problems from its inceptions. It was never a big money maker. And ultimately it sold out to the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about today centers on, I don't know if we have anybody from Tennessee originally. Clarksville, Tennessee is the town that's sort of the centerpiece of this railroad. It's of course in the name, Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville. By just a quick overview of the city, it sits on the Cumberland River, which was very important in its early development. European Americans came to the area in the 18th century. Started was really out in the woods. When they say it was being in the woods, it's not a misnomer at that point in time. This was sort of the western frontier in some of those early years, this 18th century. And it wasn't really a big city in terms of Civil War battles. It wasn't. There was some fighting in and around the area, but it was never a huge city. What it really became known for before the Civil War and also after the Civil War was tobacco. It was a huge tobacco distribution point, which helped its riverboat traffic and, of course, helped when the railroads, I should say, there were other railroads that built into this town in the years after the Civil War. But it was, it's not any tobacco, I don't really believe anymore, that's grown in that area. But in that era, there was a dark fired tobacco, and I'm no tobacco expert, but it was a certain particular type of tobacco that was grown in Middle Tennessee and Western Kentucky. And Clarksville was really the centerpiece for that. And that was really one of the key drivers for building a railroad, was to be able to haul tobacco to markets. If you think about it, this was an era, when you wanted to go from point A to point B, you either had to walk, ride a horse, or get on a stagecoach. Clarksville, Tennessee today is about an hour north of Nashville, Tennessee on Interstate 24. Stagecoach could take hours, maybe even the better part of a day to traverse between those two cities. So the railroad, like in so many places, was a real game changer for being able to move from point A to point B. Despite maybe how some in the press might have viewed the railroad, it did really attract some key backers early on. And I won't go too in depth in any of these folks, but I'll point them out very quickly. The gentleman on the left is a guy named William Quarles. He was fought in the Civil War. He actually organized an infantry division that fought at Fort Donelson in February of 1862. And later on, he actually marched with John Bell Hood from Atlanta to Nashville and was a prisoner of war in the final year of the conflict. Next to him, second from the left, is a guy named Gustavus Adolphus Henry, who was actually a pretty big politician within the Whig Party in 19th century Tennessee politics. Although he's sort of forgotten by history, and of course, where I sit here in Georgia, we don't really necessarily not well remembered necessarily, but he was a pretty big person, and he was actually a president of the railroad a couple times, and was very involved in its building. And he actually ran for governor of Tennessee in 1853, but lost to Andrew Johnson, who we know later served as the 17th president of the United States. Next to him is a gentleman named Charles Tyler, who was a judge and leader in Montgomery County, which is where Clarksville, Tennessee is located. And on the far right is a gentleman named Joshua Cobb, military. He went to the United States Military Academy at West Point, and was noted for his practical business sense. And I just very quickly point out some of these folks who were backers of the railroad, just to show that even though maybe the press was a little fickle towards the prospects of the railroad, railroads like the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville really were able to capture the leaders in the community, and they were really able to get them as key backers. And that was really important in 19th century railroad. Without doing a full in-depth analysis of how you built a railroad, basically required you walking up and down the line and asking people to give you money to support your business endeavor. And so when you had folks like Gustavus Henry knocking on your door and saying, "I'm throwing my weight behind this railroad," it really made it a really reputable business operation. So even though it struggled mightily, it did have some key backers behind it, which I think is really a really pretty interesting piece of this particular railroad's history. And ultimately, even though it was chartered in January of 1852, it took until about 1856 for them actually to turn dirt and break ground on the railroad. So it took a few years to raise the funding, to do all the survey work behind it. But once they actually started putting shovels into the dirt and breaking ground and actually starting some of the construction on it, this was a railroad that was very closely watched, certainly in the Clarksville community throughout Middle Tennessee, but really regionally. You saw a lot of really captured the imagination of people in Louisville. Of course, they were quite excited about the prospect of opening a direct railroad connection down to Memphis. But it was something that really just people across the country were really watching, and they realized how much this could really change merchandise and commerce westward from the north and into the west. And I love this quote. This is from Louisville Courier, said in 1856. Thus, this important work is fully commenced, and it'll be a few months until the iron horse will be panting over what is yet untouched ground. And I love the optimism that these railroads were really able to engender in newspaper writers and really the communities. And what I think is so telling is the optimism was so great that you read here, it would be a few months until the iron horse will be panting, right? This is 1856, they're writing this. It took 5 years to actually get to that point. But you constantly, when you would read about this railroad, you see how people talked about it, it was always about to open. So for 5 years, you would read about it. It's going to open any day now. They still had to lay all the tracks. They still had to buy the locomotives. And they still had to do all this incredible amount of work. They had to build a tunnel, they had to, build bridges and everything. But people were just so excited about this railroad because they understood how much it could change their community. And talking back to the Clarksville, Tennessee region, which is a pretty small town, it had 3,000-4,000 people by the turn of the Civil War. That was really a way that they could grow a city. I mean, that could really make a city from just a little either trading post or a little stop on the river into a real destination and a real shipping point for tobacco in their particular case. And I think the optimism is also captured here. This whole idea of the whistle of a locomotive, it's going to be a powerful appeal. And in what the newspapers constantly had to urge people to do was to support and aid the railroad to make it happen. Because again, building a railroad, unless you were state funded, which we're going to get to in a moment with our other railroad, it really required the community to get behind it and open up their wallets. And when you were a small community like Clarksville and you were building in a very rural area, you were limited in the resources that you had to be able to make that happen. But what's incredible about it, I mentioned Clarksville sitting on the Cumberland River. They were able to build this incredible bridge across the Cumberland River. And I don't know, I can't really see a show of hands. So I'd say everyone to raise your hand if you've been to Clarksville, but you can look it up online. There's this incredible railroad bridge that some of the bridge piers are actually original on it. But it's the first time I ever went to the city. It was the first thing I ever noticed. Of course, as a rail fan, that's the first thing I'm going to notice is either the train depot or the giant train bridge in the middle of town. But they built this incredible structure that crossed the river, the Cumberland River, which is it's not the Mississippi River in terms of how wide it is, but it's still a pretty formidable river to have to cross. And they were able to build this bridge in 1860. And actually, the first train operated across the bridge in 1860, August of 1860. And there's kind of a funny story about it. Everybody knew this bridge, the train was going to take a test steam, not really a test drive, a test steam over the bridge. And word started spreading throughout the community, and people started turning out on what was actually a Monday, August 6th of 1860. And the engineer who was behind the throttle of what was the W.B. Munford locomotive, starts easing out onto the bridge. There were some people who actually, in addition to the engineer, who were riding on the bridge, on the locomotive as it started. People just really wanted to see this incredible feat transpire. And there were maybe a dozen people on the locomotive who were riding across, and people were lined up across the tracks to watch it. The locomotive eases onto the bridge. You can actually, apparently, by one account, it cracks a little bit as it goes out. Probably some of the timbers squeak a little bit. I'm sure people were probably presuming it wasn't going to hold the weight of the locomotive, but it did. It crossed the bridge, and it was just this moment of incredible optimism. And this is a quote that the local newspaper had in August of 1860. The test has been made, and a train passed over this beautiful bridge, noble structure. It bore the ponderous tread of the iron horse without a strain or quiver. And I love the way that people in that era talked about things, and the way newspapers described events. A little bit different than maybe how the newspapers of today and the media of today describes things. But it was such this moment of optimism, as though this incredible hurdle had been passed. And even though they were able to build this bridge across the Cumberland River, the railroad still wasn't complete. This is August of 1860. It would really be another year until they completely finished the railroad. Of course, August of 1860 is really a matter of months away from something that would really change the entire country, and certainly the fate of every community and every railroad, but the Civil War. And that broke out, of course, in April of 1861. And Tennessee saw some really rough fighting. It wasn't the scene of the earliest of battles during the Civil War, but this area saw some big fighting in February of 1862, in particular, along the Cumberland River, Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, if you're familiar with those two. But this railroad was really incredibly important to the Confederacy and its ability to be able to transport troops, to be able to transport goods. And the local newspaper certainly realized that, and some of the local military strategists realized that. And when I say military strategists, it wasn't just those folks on the Confederate side. It was Union folks as well that understood the importance of the railroad and how they might actually be able to be used in battle. And I put a couple pictures up here. These are a couple of the leaders who were involved in the fighting in this particular region. On the left, we have Henry Halleck, fairly well-known general during the Civil War. In the middle there is William Andrew Quarles. I mentioned him a moment ago. He was on the Confederate side. And a gentleman on the right who we're going to discuss a couple times today, a guy named Don Carlos Buell, but he certainly realized the importance of the railroad and how it could play into that. So if you'll remember him for a moment, we're going to get back to him in a moment, but he plays a pretty critical role in something that happens on the second railroad that we're going to talk about today. Ultimately, the railroad, Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, like so many railroads in the country during the Civil War, was destroyed. It operated in bits and pieces during the Civil War. The bridge over the Cumberland River was burned pretty quickly in 1862. So the railroad was, for the most part, out of operation. Again, it had some limited service in about 1863 and 1864. But ultimately, in the year after the Civil War, once it ended in 65, everybody, for the most part, got back to rebuilding their communities, rebuilding their businesses, and that included rebuilding the railroads. And this is a quote that appeared in the local newspaper in August of 1866, and it talks about, whatever bitterness of the past there was, and we have to restore this great artery of social and commercial life. I thought was really interesting when you look at this. We're in August of 1866. We're only about 10 years after the railroad broke ground. The railroad broke ground, took 5 years to complete, never really operated because the Civil War happened. It's completely destroyed. And yet here we are almost starting all over again, right? It's almost the same level of euphoria that there was 10 years earlier with that groundbreaking ceremony, of the hope and the optimism that follows this great artery, as the newspaper called it, because it really was an entity that played an important role in, as they point out, social and commercial life. So there was a lot of optimism for the return of the railroad. Without getting too deep into sort of the social elements at play, this is a little bit of a return to normal, perhaps, in the years after the Civil War. The railroad began operations on August 13th of 1866, and basically had about 18 months of operation. I won't say it was a great and prosperous time for the railroad, because it was not a great and prosperous time. It was a railroad that, even though it was back to normal, there were a lot of underlying problems that were facing it. This was an area, there wasn't a lot of freight along this railroad. It basically, as I mentioned earlier on, it formed a part of the Memphis Branch Railroad, which ran between Louisville and Memphis. So basically, people were just passed over the railroad. Unfortunately for the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, that meant there wasn't a lot of money to be made off freight or passengers. So the one thing that kind of cursed this railroad from the start was a lack of revenue, which anybody who's ever run a business, it doesn't even have to be a railroad, knows that if you're not making money, it's a lot harder to do business. And ultimately, what that meant for this railroad was that they weren't able to pay their employees. And you may or may not know, people, when they're not paid, generally don't like to work. They're not there to volunteer to run your railroad. And ultimately, what happened in February of 1868, again, only about 18 months after the railroad opened after the Civil War, was the workers decided they weren't getting paid. They were going to go on strike. And not good for the railroad, obviously, because that meant whatever freight revenues and passenger revenues they were able to take in, they weren't making. And it really became a political hot potato, I guess, for lack of a better term. The governor of the state of Tennessee at that point in time decided he would weigh in on the matter. It was a guy named William G. Brownlow. Here's a picture of him. And I love this. He called it a regular conspiracy against the state authorities and the road. And he said he would not yield to the mob spirit. So he was kind of thrown down here a little bit, I guess you could say, and he wasn't amused by the idea that the workers walked off the job. The local newspaper, the Clarksville Weekly Chronicle, or the Clarksville Chronicle, I should say, had the back of the newspapers. They decided they didn't like the governor effectively taking the side of the railroad over the workers. They decided to call him the Imp of Darkness. And they said that his remarks were a slander against the men who are superiors in his everything. I'd like to just point out here very quickly, anybody who says that our politics is dirty today, and this is sort of a new phenomenon, you can go back and look in history, and we've kind of always been a little bit dirty politically throughout history. So this became a real problem for the railroad. It was only through the good graces, business decision, maybe is the better way to say it, of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which decided that they needed to run trains over the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, and the best option for them was to effectively bail out the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad. So they funneled some money into the MC&L. They were able to get workers paid, and they were able to get trains running again. What they didn't do is they didn't purchase, at this point in time, the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, but they effectively propped it up financially. Which was maybe a good move for the Louisville and Nashville, because we're just paying a little bit of money to get the trains moving, but we don't have any of the liabilities that come with running this particular section of railroad. That, from the MCNL perspective, became a problem about a year later when there was a pretty bad train wreck that happened in just outside of Clarksville, Tennessee, a little section of track called Budds Creek. Exactly what happened is open to a lot of debate, but effectively a trestle collapsed, a passenger train from Memphis crashed into probably a dry creek at that point, and there wasn't probably any water running through it. Train caught fire, and 4, maybe 5, depending on which account you want to believe, people died in the wreck. And was a pretty big deal, at least from a news perspective, nationally, actually, even internationally, for a few days. A lot of conspiracy theories about what exactly happened. Maybe vandals at work. We'll say that's a different story for a different day. But ultimately, what it ultimately illustrated was the fact that this railroad, which broke ground in 1856, was rebuilt in 1866. Workers went on strike in 1868, was in a terrible shape. Was in a really bad state of repair or lack of repair for a railroad that had basically operated for about 2 years. Was not well constructed and was really struggling to operate. It's interesting. This was 5 people killed. Is certainly not to downplay any loss of life. Certainly, this wasn't the biggest wreck that had ever happened in the 19th century, but it was one that, for some reason, even though it's largely forgotten by history today, was one that really captured a lot of headlines and ultimately helped bring about a state investigation into not just this railroad, this railroad and other railroads in Tennessee, about really what to do with it. This was, again, they're not making money, having all sorts of problems. And ultimately, this investigation actually blamed the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for that Budds Creek disaster, which is interesting in a way, because what the state decided the best course of action to be was to sell the railroad. It's not worth having anymore. It's not making money. It's just a drain on the state, which also was helping to prop it up in 19th century versions of government bailouts. And ultimately, what happened with this railroad is the Louisville and Nashville stepped in and in 1871 purchased the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad for about $1.7 million. I don't know if that would be a steal in that era, but seems pretty steep for a railroad that wasn't making any money. But ultimately, the Louisville and Nashville took control of the entire Louisville to Memphis branch. This railroad continued to operate intact as a complete Louisville to Nashville run until the 1980s, and a portion of it still remains today as part of R.J. Corman's Memphis branch. We're going to get back to that in a moment, but I did just want to point out one direct connection that it had to the next railroad that we're going to talk about, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. I mentioned a moment ago Don Carlos Buell. In February and March of 1862, when he was in charge of troops in and around Fort Donelson area, he employed this gentleman just beneath him here, who anybody who's familiar with the Western and Atlantic Railroad is probably familiar with James J. Andrews, who was a smuggler who probably worked both sides and probably smuggled for both sides during the Civil War. But he was a civilian employee of Don Carlos Buell. And in March of 1862, he devised this incredible scheme to basically go behind enemy lines, go down to Atlanta. He was going to meet an engineer. They were going to steal a train, and they were going to destroy Southern railroads. It was a foolproof plan. Nothing could possibly go wrong, except for the fact that the engineer did not show up in Atlanta, and they had to scurry back to behind northern lines, back to safety. Undeterred, however, James J. Andrews went to a different general who was then in charge in the area, a guy named Ormsby Mitchell, and devised a second plan. But instead of relying on meeting a train engineer in Atlanta, he decided he would bring his own. And in 1862, April, in fact, of 1862, Andrews and about 24 men went down to Marietta and stole the general from Kennesaw, Georgia. And we remember that fondly as the Great Locomotive Chase, or the Andrews Raid. So there's a little bit of another connection between these two railroads. So we'll use that as a segue to talk about the Western and Atlantic Railroad. And I mentioned the general a moment ago. This is a picture of the general probably from the 1930s. You can, of course, see it at the Southern Museum in Kennesaw, Georgia. Very quickly, I give a very quick timeline of the railroad. This one is a little bit older than the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, and it dates to the 1830s. But it really wasn't until 1850 that it was truly completed when the tunnel up at Tunnel Hill was opened. And about a decade later, of course, the Great Locomotive Chase in April of 1862. And while that's the moment in time, the event on the railroad that I think most people probably associate with the Western and Atlantic Railroad, I like to point out that was probably about 9 hours that the entire episode took, and that's 9 hours in the history of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. And I think this railroad has just such a deep and interesting history. And the 1870s in particular, or late 1860s, 1870s, are a great bit of history. A lot of politics were involved in it, and ultimately that's when the state decided to lease the railroad. And the state has leased the railroad. The state paid to build it and operate it for the first few years, but has leased it since 1870, and effectively since 1890, it's been to the same railroad or one of its successors, which is today CSX Transportation. So this is the railroad that you get stopped at when you're driving through Marietta or Vinings or any number of North Georgia cities there. Very quickly, I presume everybody's familiar with all these different railroads, but I'll just throw them out quickly. Again, the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad leased the railroad from 1890 to 1957. That ultimately became the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. It seems like every railroad I study or look into, the L&N somehow is tied to it. And it became part of the Seaboard system. And again, that is CSX Transportation today. Whenever I talk about the Western and Atlantic, people always ask about sort of the legacy of the railroad. I think a lot of people maybe don't realize that the state still owns it today, even though they just lease it to a private enterprise. You really can't talk about the Western and Atlantic without talking about the southern terminus on the line. A small little community as it was, initially named Terminus. We know it today by a different name, Atlanta. It's a small little community. Again, this is what it looked like in the 1850s. And what's interesting to me is, while you can't imagine Georgia and really even the Southeast without Atlanta, this is a quote from Stephen Harriman Long, the chief engineer of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, who didn't think the city was going to be much. He thought it would be a good location for a tavern, blacksmith, grocery store, and nothing else. You don't need me to tell you that he was a little bit off on his estimation, although I was just excited with the tavern. So once it had one tavern, I was particularly fine, if that's all it ever amounted to. But obviously, Atlanta has more than just one tavern. But it really changed the future of, and really the trajectory and the growth of middle Georgia and Georgia as a whole, and really the Southeast. And I think that's the real legacy of the railroad. And what I'd like to do is, when I give presentations about the Western Atlantic, I like to touch on some of the key moments that really shaped the railroad. And to me, one of the first ones is, of course, the first train that ever operated, which operated in December of 1842 between Atlanta and Marietta. Again, the railroad was chartered in 1836, and it really didn't fully open, as I mentioned, until 1850. In 1842, they had a few miles of tracks that they were able to take a locomotive. It was a locomotive named the Florida, and they were able to steam it from Atlanta to Marietta. And when it got to the bridge, this is a later incarnation of the bridge over the Chattahoochee River, much like the bridge on the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, where there might have been some concern about whether it could support the weight of a locomotive. The passengers who were on this initial excursion decided they wouldn't test their luck. They actually got off the train. They made the train come to a complete stop. They crossed the bridge on foot and watched as the train slowly lumbered its way across the bridge. Luckily for everybody involved, the bridge was able to support the weight of the locomotive. But I think it really illustrates the idea. When you're in 1840, we think about railroads today, we kind of just take them for granted, right? We know them, we've grown up with them, we've seen some version of a railroad our entire life. Maybe it's only when we're sitting at the grade crossing and we're, cursing in our cars that we're stuck behind a long freight train as it's going by. But if you think about in the 1830s and 1840s and 50s, a lot of people had never seen a locomotive, never seen a train. So this is an incredible sight. If you're seeing this steaming object going down the tracks for the very first time, and if you think about it getting to a bridge, it must have been incredibly scary. It would definitely make you nervous if you didn't know if this was going to be able to support the train. And this is how someone had recorded it. One of the passengers on that very first trip had talked about it. Some magnificent scenery along the state road, natural as well as artificial. Today, they might be talking about all the townhouses that were built along the state road, but there was some scenery back then. But to see a steam car walking like a thing of life is grand to look upon. Again, this was an incredible change. And I mentioned a little bit earlier in the Clarksville area, if you wanted to get from point A to point B, you pretty much had to walk or take a horse or maybe take a stagecoach or some sort of a wagon. But this was really change, of course, how we were able to maneuver and our mobility just as people and communities. And again, we talked a little bit about the Great Locomotive Chase. I'm not going to dwell on the Great Locomotive Chase, but even when it changed how we fought wars and how we were able to, unfortunately, that's a negative connotation, a negative influence that the railroad had. But it really did change warfare as well, and changed how we were able to go about that. And this was a notice that was put in the Southern Confederacy in 1850 or 1862, rather, right after the Great Locomotive Chase, that never let an engine be left alone for a moment. So it was really, railroads were by then becoming a part of every aspect of life. But to me, I mentioned a moment ago, the most interesting part of the Western and Atlantic Railroad was really that post-Civil War era. Much like the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, the Western and Atlantic was really heavily beat up, we'll say, and it took a heavy toll during the Civil War. It fared a little bit better in the sense that trains operated over it for the entirety of the Civil War. But in the 1860s, the railroad was basically in ruins and, well, for the most part, had to be rebuilt from Atlanta to Chattanooga. And this was an era of Reconstruction. And again, not getting into the pros and cons of Reconstruction and the politics of it, it did yield some colorful characters, if nothing else. The gentleman here on the left is the wartime, or the post-war governor, I should say, of Georgia, a guy named Rufus Bullock, who in 1860s Georgia had two things working against him. He was from New York, and he was a Republican, two things that didn't really go well in Georgia. But he had a lot of other folks around him as well. The guy in the middle here is a guy named Hannibal Kimball, who was a businessman who was involved in a lot of schemes, a lot of them railroad related. But he was actually instrumental in helping the state capital move from what was then Millersville to Atlanta. And he also built these incredible, two versions of it, but this incredible hotel right in the heart of Atlanta in the Five Points area, known as the Kimball House. There's a restaurant in Decatur that has borrowed the name. That's not the original Kimball House. The original Kimball House was this structure here, opened in 1870. It later burned and was replaced by a second Kimball House. And unfortunately, as is so much of Atlanta and Georgia history, it is today a parking deck, which is kind of a shame. But these grand structures that really shaped Atlanta. So I started out this presentation on the Western Atlantic piece of it, talking about the legacy of the railroad being Atlanta. You really can see how this really became a center of commerce, particularly in the post-war years. Unfortunately, in those post-war years, there was a lot of politics connected to it. There were a lot of allegations that were tossed about. A lot of people profiteered potentially off the railroad. And ultimately, state lawmakers didn't know what to do. They had a lot of debate over it. And ultimately, what they decided the best thing to do would be to lease the railroad, get the state out of the operations of the actual railroad. And that was really a pivotal moment in the history of the railroad, because in 1870, they began leasing the railroad to a company that was organized or involved this gentleman here, who's Joseph Brown. He was the wartime governor of Georgia. Later was a state Supreme Court justice, and starting in 1870, he was a railroad operator. This picture here of the Ackworth locomotive, I believe it was delivered to the railroad in 1881. So this is kind of how the railroads of that era would have looked. But Joseph Brown, who there was actually a statue of Brown outside the state capitol in Atlanta, he and his partners operated the railroad for 20 years. They held the lease until 1890. And in 1890, the state ultimately decided to lease it to the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad. And what I think is so interesting about that is that is effectively the lease that we have in place today, or successor railroad, I should say, has the lease in place. But basically, since 1890, CSX Transportation or its predecessors have leased this railroad. So I think that's actually really pretty interesting. But Nashville and Chattanooga was the NC and St. L. It's a mouthful to say. Really did a few good things for the railroad. And one of the things that they did is they used it as a marketing tool. This is, of course, by this point, we're about 20, 30 years after the Civil War. So a lot of people who fought in the Civil War are starting to pass on. And there became a lot of interest in the war and going to see the battle sites and the battlefields and sort of all these places that people have known from history. And so this image here in the top middle, there is a guidebook that the NC and St. L used to help bring people who started taking tours and taking day trips out on the railroad. And the railroad also built little pavilions up and down the line. There's, if you know, where next to the Pace House is the in Vinings, Georgia. There's a little pavilion there, railroad pavilion, but really became an avenue for people to take trips on. But it also, during this era, really became a real means of transportation. And Atlanta was really, before it had the Hartsfield-Jackson of today, it had Union Station in downtown Atlanta. And really from there, you could get anywhere you needed to go. On the right here is an advertisement from a newspaper in 1901. And you look at all these destinations: St. Louis in the west, Chicago in the northwest, trains to Louisville and Cincinnati. And in this era, when it became part of the NC and St. L, it seems like it turned a corner a little bit. And maybe it's just how railroads evolved in this era, but it's really becoming a real part of the transportation network and really was able to usher people anywhere in the country. And ultimately, this is the era where it really becomes the modern Western and Atlantic, and starting to become the railroad that we know of today. Of course, the L&N owned the NC and St. L, even though they became one railroad in 1957. It had owned it for several years. And the L&N really issued or started some interesting and some really luxurious passenger trains. In 1946, it launched the Georgian train, which is a train that ran from Atlanta all the way up to, there were different iterations of it. It ran to Chicago and St. Louis over the years. And this was really a great way to travel. But unfortunately for railroads, there were just a few years of this great luxurious travel. Because in the 50s, we got the interstate system. In the 60s, we started getting into the jet age. And by the 70s, passenger travel was really not the way to go. And I think this is actually a pretty interesting juxtaposition. On the left here, you've got this, the two different timetables from the L&N. On the left here, you've got this great advertisement. It's talking about faster service, finer service. It's an overnight train. And then this one on the right here is from 1971, I think it is. And you see there's no stops really on the train. They're advertising their freight network. And you can see passenger trains had really fallen off by the 1970s, which is kind of a shame. And this is right in the era when Amtrak came in, took over passenger trains across the country. Unfortunately, they didn't take over any of the trains that operate on the Western and Atlantic Railroad. And the L&N ended its passenger service in 1971 on the Western and Atlantic Railroad. And that's really the last time we've had regular passenger train service. And despite all the discussions we've had about commuter rail potentially running on that line one day, we haven't yet seen it. What I think is interesting in this era, too, is there were a lot of discussions about the future of the railroad. I don't know if anybody recalls, just a couple of years ago, 2018, I believe it was, that the most recent lease on the Western and Atlantic Railroad to CSX Transportation for 50 years. It almost happened without any discussion and really without much publicity. There wasn't much press about it. In the 1960s, there was a big discussion about the railroad. The Southern Railway actually decided that they wanted to lease the railroad and tried to step in and take over the railroad, the lease. They kind of got in a little bit of a bidding war, and there's a lot of politics involved, and ultimately ended up having some discussions, leading to some discussions about what should we do with the railroad? Should we maintain it? Should we keep it? Continue to lease it? Sell it outright? And there was a lot of back and forth about potentially even selling the railroad. And there were some bills that were introduced in the state legislature. But ultimately, I think the lieutenant governor at the time, Lieutenant Governor George Smith was his name, he summed it up best when he said, "I don't believe in the state getting in business, but we have the railroad and we're going to keep it," which I think is kind of what the mentality of probably politicians today is. We don't, maybe they wouldn't get into the business of owning a railroad, but they have it. And I think the most recent lease brings in about $1.2 billion, if I'm not mistaken, over 50 years to the state for basically owning a 137-mile long strip of land between Atlanta and Chattanooga. But this era was also interesting too because it was really not a good era for railroads. And the 1970s in particular were pretty bad, certainly for the L&N. I don't know if we have a lot of L&N fans here. A lot of varied opinions about the L&N and some of its track operations over the years. But really what you saw was the Western and Atlantic by the late 70s and early 80s was kind of in a state of disrepair. There were a lot of derailments up and down the line. There were sections of the railroad that there were speed restrictions on. Trains couldn't operate very quickly, and it got a lot of discussion, a lot of publicity about how bad a state of repair the railroad was in. And ultimately, what you saw happen kind of followed a national trend. There was some legislation federally, the Staggers Act in 1980, that did some deregulation and ultimately led to a renaissance of rail. And in 30, 40 years, since then, 40 years at this point, since that law went into effect, what you've seen is the Western and Atlantic Railroad is today, it's top-notch railroad. It's well regarded. It's operated by CSX Transportation, and it's really lives up to its name as a Class I railroad. So very quickly, I know we're kind of approaching the time here, and I want to be cognizant of that. I really just want to talk what about, I think, the biggest legacy of the railroad is, and it's really the communities up and down the line. And again, we talked a little bit about Atlanta. I think the one thing that I wish Atlanta had was one of these depots. Maybe not these ones here, because these would be pretty old by this point in time. But you've got these other depots that appeared in 1871 and 1930. These are different iterations of Union Depot that were built. And unfortunately, much like so much of Atlanta history, it doesn't exist anymore, and it's been replaced by various structures and various, torn down over the years, which I think is a shame. The one on the left here is Union Station that was built in 1871. The one on the right was Union Station that opened up in 1930, and it stood till about 71, 72. But unfortunately, like so many things in Atlanta, it's a little bit lost to history. But Atlanta is just one piece of the community, one community on the line, I should say. Other communities, you can find their depots up and down the line. You've got Marietta, Cartersville, Ringgold, my favorite depot up in Tunnel Hill. Unfortunately, the depot on the center bottom there, Kingston, burned in the 1970s. But Kingston is a great town with a great railroad history. And on the bottom right there is Dalton, Georgia. Had been a restaurant. Last I knew, it was a vacant building. I think it's actually for sale. So if you ever wanted to buy a train depot, this could be your time to buy the Dalton train depot. But very quickly, and I'll be happy to answer any questions for sure. When you look at the two different railroads and you put them side by side, they originate in the same era. Again, that ante-bellum era, right? 1836 versus 1852, opened in 50 versus 61. Western and Atlantic was not quite twice as long as the MC&L, but they both of them ultimately went to the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. Again, one by lease, one by sale. It's a little bit of a simplistic way to look at it. But I think when you compare the two railroads with completely different outcomes, the Western and Atlantic Railroad is today an integral part of the nation's transportation network, whereas the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville, not to say short lines are not an integral part of it, it's part of a short line railroad. And I think that two of the big factors that played into it, Western and Atlantic, of course, had state funding, state backing for the early part of its years, whereas the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville was built largely with private funds. The Western Atlantic remained part of CSX and a vital part of that network, whereas the MC&L ultimately became, once it all went into the L&N, there were other routes that also went between Nashville and Memphis, and ultimately was just supplanted by those other routes. And again, Western and Atlantic is part of CSX, whereas the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville is part of the short line, the R.J. Corman's Memphis line, short branch railroad, which operates, that portion of it operates from Clarksville or Guthrie, Kentucky to Cumberland City, Tennessee, roughly. So with that, that's kind of a quick overview of two railroads. I could go on for hours, but I'm sure people don't want a 12-hour presentation on the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville in the Western and Atlantic, but certainly be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
And I think what I will do, I haven't seen any pop up in the chat section yet. Although I would echo a comment that very nice presentation, and it is very clear that you're passionate about it and well spoken about it. It's very cool. Let me unmute people. Um, they're now free to unmute. Um, Sally, you should be unmuted, but I'll make sure. Yeah, you're on. Oh, you're unmuted, Sally.
I just did it. What about the two books that you have available, Todd?
Absolutely. If anybody is interested in purchasing a copy, I'd be happy to sign it. If you want to jot down my email address, might be the easiest way. They're available in any bookstore. Of course, you can get them on Amazon, but I can cut you a deal, and I'll be happy to beat Amazon pricing on them as well. And if you're locally, I'd be happy to deliver it as well.
Wow, very good.
I have other ones too. I have my newest ones on the Northeast Corridor as well, just came out. I have a couple others as well, but you can find out any information on my website there.
Very good. Enjoyed it a lot. It's
Yes.
very informative.
Thank you. It was a lot of information to squeeze into 45 minutes. So I hope I didn't lose anybody as I was going through it. I realized as I was going through it, I felt like it was speeding along there.
Yeah, no, we held on to our participants, so you
Good.
did a good job.
Yeah.
Very nice, Todd.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was interesting. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much for being our clinician tonight.
Absolutely. Always happy to chat about the railroads. And please jot down my email address. And again, you don't have to no sales pitch. If you just have any questions or anything, feel free to send me a note. I'm always happy to answer as best I know or make it up if I don't.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Hey, Todd. Todd, I
Yes.
do have a question.
Sure.
So I remember coming up here in the '80s, and I guess the old Smyrna depot was moved from its original location. Am I correct? When they widened the road.
The Smyrna one, as I understand it, I think it was the original. Well, there were two depots in Smyrna actually. There was the Western and Atlantic Depot, which I've always been told was torn down in about, I think it was 1959. But there was also a depot for what was the Atlanta Northern Railway rather, which is the interurban that ran between Atlanta and Marietta.
Yeah.
It might have been that depot, which stood until about the 1980s, as I understand.
There was one in the 1980s, and it was it was a steep slope cut right there to the road.
Mm-hmm.
And when they decided to widen South Atlanta Road, they moved the depot. And then now the depot that's there now is not where originally it stood.
Correct. It's right. That's a replica that was built in the 90s, I want to
90s,
say. Yeah, that sounds about right. And it's near the location, but yeah, it's not exactly on the location. It must have been where they got a good deal on the land, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that was a real busy
Todd,
point right there. That's why I mentioned that, because the long siding going into Atlanta right there as it approached the north end of the yard. So
Absolutely.
that was a major siding right there.
If I remember driving to Marietta, I insist on driving up Atlanta Road just to try to see what I can see parked, and because there's always one or two trains usually parked there.
Yep.
Yeah, and they stretch them out.
Todd,
Right
I
there.
have a question.
Absolutely.
This is George Fickle, and I wondered about obviously the railroads took a real hit during the Civil War. Was it government money that helped get them back on their feet after the war, or was it private funds for these two railroads?
A little bit of both. There was some government money that came in. There was some state money. The Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville in particular did get some state funding throughout, even before the Civil War. But there was federal money that went into it, and there was actually a large back and forth between the state of Tennessee and the federal government over whether it had ever been paid off. And so the federal money came in to help rebuild it. The railroad also had to outlay some of its own funding to buy rolling stock and equipment from the federal government. But ultimately, there was, I forget the exact number. There was like $1.5 million that the state of Tennessee took from the federal government to help rebuild the MC&L. And I don't think that money actually has ever been paid off. I think the debt was just forgiven at some point in time.
The MCNL was built. Did the original investors in it not realize that there really weren't any customers on it, or did they build it because they thought it would attract customers?
Oh, I think I might have gone out there. Did that all come through?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. My audio cut out there for a second.
Okay, maybe my question didn't get through then. The MCNL was built, was it built hopefully to attract customers? Because if there weren't very many customers on the line, therefore they didn't have a lot of revenue from freight or passengers, why did they build the railroad in the first place?
That's the $1 million question, I feel like.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No. It's a great question. And I think there's probably a couple things. Yes, I think they used fuzzy math probably to begin with, which didn't help the initial equation. I think they thought they would get more freight on it. And it wasn't that I mean, there definitely were customers, but it really was a through section of the railroad. And there's a later history. I actually have a second book that follows up the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville. It was another railroad that they were going to build between Mobile, Alabama, and Evansville, Indiana. That basically was all the same people involved that wanted to build another railroad. So people in this community, in part, always wanted a railroad for whatever reason. They thought it was going to help the city grow. They saw a lot of growth that would come with it. And for any number of reasons, that growth never happened when they built these railroads. So I think they were really optimistic that they could grow it and their city would grow with it. And it never came, and it never came to fruition. From the L&N perspective, it was trackage worth having because it really extended their network and they were able to haul freight over it. But I think from the MCNL standpoint, it just didn't make business sense for any number of reasons, but ultimately because they just never were able to track the level of business. And there wasn't a ton of even despite the tobacco in the area, there wasn't really a lot of industry. And there were definitely some industries, but there weren't a ton of industries in that area.
Okay. Just wondered.
It's interesting. It's probably wouldn't make much business sense today if you were trying to build it today.
Okay. Any more questions for Todd? Specialty business.
I guess not. Thank you, Todd.
Well, perfect. Absolutely. Yeah. And again, please jot down my note. If you think of something later, just send me an email. Always happy to, again, answer anything I know or make it up.
Very cool.
That sounds great. We really appreciate your time tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here today.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Well, everybody have a safe night, and I guess we'll see you in a month.
Yep.
Hey, we
Have
ain't
a
got to
good
worry
night,
about
all.
driving home.
Yeah. Have a good night, all. Thank you for attending.
Yes.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night now.
Good night, everyone. Good seeing everybody.
Good night.
Everybody stay safe.
People are slowly disappearing. I guess some people just don't want to leave. Good night, all.